I'm Luther Martin. I'm Professor of Religion Emeritus at the University of Vermont. The first thing I did after I retired was to teach a term at Masaryk University. I'm trained as a historian of religion, specifically Greco-Roman religions, with an interest in theory and method. The interest in theory and method has led me to cognitive science of religion. And I am interested then in how cognitive science can help me as a historian understand phenomena from the past, and to what extent historians can help cognitive scientists get some of their assumptions correct as they develop experimental designs. When I taught, I didn't have graduate students, only undergraduate students. And what was interesting is that in universities, students in virtually any subject are presented with explanatory paradigms, except maybe language or literature studies. Now, whether these explanatory paradigms work or not, if you take economics courses, if you take political science courses, they try to explain what's going on. This is not true historically in the study of religion. The study of religion has typically not offered any sort of explanatory theories. My own description of what departments of religion do, I'm speaking now about the United States and Canada, but I think this is true in Europe as well, is primarily religion appreciation courses. Rather than any kind of scientific or explanatory studies. There's an assumption, a general assumption in the study of religion is that religion is good. Now, that may be, it may not be, but it's an assumption that it shouldn't simply be assumed. We should study it and see, which we do with all other disciplines. So if you study political science, for example, you study about communist systems. That doesn't mean they're good. You study about fascism. It doesn't mean it's good or bad, but in a scientific study, you look at the various alternatives. Religious studies rarely does that. It's always interested me that atheism is not a topic covered in religious studies departments. It's rarely mentioned. So I think there's this general assumption that religion's good, and we shouldn't question it, we should just understand it and appreciate it. The experimental study of religion, of course, begins to offer possibilities for explaining religion. From an evolutionary perspective, why is it that Homo sapiens, the species Homo sapiens, ever developed religion in the first place? Why does the species continue to invest resources in service of beings that don't exist? I mean, it's a very interesting human phenomenon to be explained. I think it's an interesting phenomenon because if we can ever explain religious behavior, I think we have actually an avenue to looking at broader cultural issues. So to the extent that religion is a cultural phenomenon, it becomes an example, a very complex example of other cultural phenomena. There is in the German tradition the distinction between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, and never the twain should meet. I think this is a false dichotomy. One of the things that interests me when I talk about my colleagues in the humanities is what have the humanities produced in terms of a corpus of knowledge in, say, the last 2,500 years, compared with what has the sciences produced in terms of a corpus of knowledge in the last 150 years. I don't think the humanities have produced knowledge, a cumulative base of knowledge that we can build on and continue to learn. My hyperbolical Example is, it seems to me that humanistic scholars are the heirs of the medieval monastery, in which monks go into their cells and meditate for 24 hours and never speak to anyone. What humanistic scholars do is go into their offices, sit by themselves, write articles that they publish in journals that nobody reads. And then somebody else comes along 10 years later and does the same thing. There's no progress in knowledge. There's no accumulation of knowledge. There's no falsification of knowledge. It's just this eternal quest for understanding that doesn't seem to have produced a lot in 2,500 years that anyone can agree on. So it strikes me as kind of in that sense, a dead end. Now I'm a humanist. But I think the humanities have a lot to learn from the sciences in terms of the pursuit of knowledge, what knowledge is, how we might learn from it in ways that we can build on, we can falsify or build on for the future. And so we have a more dynamic, growing field than we've had in the past. It can't be built on individual researchers. I think one thing we need to learn is how to work collaboratively. I think a lot of the scientists need to learn how to work collaboratively as well. Real scientists do. Again, an example is, I used to be amused at scientific papers where you get a 3-page paper with 15 co-authors. Whereas the humanities, you get 30-page papers with one author. There's a clear contrast in the way we're working. And in the cognitive science of religion, I'm still hearing that with a great deal of money coming into the field now and a great deal of networking and people in contact with each other, it's still primarily in support of individual research projects. So even there, I think we have ways to go. The first decade or so of cognitive science of religion saw the introduction of new theoretical paradigms. And then it sort of stopped. What we see now is a lot of testing of the theoretical paradigms that were introduced 20 years ago. In my opinion, much of the so-called research that's testing these paradigms is redundant. It's been done. One of the exciting things about LEVYNA, with its devotion primarily to experimentation, is I think this might be taking us in a good direction. We're getting some. They're interested in getting hard evidence, hard data, and testing some of these theories. So I think that's a very positive development in the field, and we'll see if they can bring it off. Donald Weeb, whom you interviewed earlier, and I are threatening to write an article entitled "When Humanists Wear Lab Coats." And it's sort of ironically saying, we don't think a lot of the people in the humanities who are, quote, doing experiments know what they're doing. They're not trained as scientists. They're not trained in experimental design, though a few younger scholars are coming along who are, by the way, and that's good. To have an institute like LEVYNA that is devoted solely to experimentation, hopefully they will be dealing with these sorts of questions. What constitutes good experimental design? How is it testable? How is it falsifiable? And so to have a whole institute that's the primary focus, I think may be a way into the future. A good way into the future. I mean, some of the things going on in LEVYNA are absolutely groundbreaking. The work of Dimitris Zougalatas on, what's he call it, experimental anthropology in the field is pioneering. And again, this LEVYNA is a place where hopefully the humanities, the distinction between the humanities and the sciences collapses, and that the humanists can actually learn experimental methods. What is a good experimental method? There's a lot of experiments out there that are just, I'm not trained as a scientist, and if I look at some experimental stuff and say this is flawed, then it's really got to be flawed for me to be able to see that. I really think we need to take more seriously, and people are here, take more seriously the scientific paradigm and how we might adapt that to the kinds of interest and questions and paradigms and hypotheses that are being generated. I have already characterized the Department of the Study of Religion at Masaryk University as one of the top departments in Europe. The reason for that is it is the least theologically oriented of any. It's the only department that doesn't have theologians on the faculty. This is rare. And so it's a perfect setting for developing a scientific study of religion, because it's a battle that doesn't have to be fought. There's still religious influence in the study of religion. You know, the old saying, people study psychology because they have problems and they're trying to solve. People go into the study of religion largely because they're interested in religion, largely as practitioners. That's no problem. The only problem is a theoretical problem or methodological problem of how do you separate one's interest in practicing religion from a study of religion. We refer to it as methodological atheism. What hopefully could be the outcome is that policymakers would learn from it. There's a great deal of, in the modern world, a great deal of decisions being made that impinge on religion or have to do with religion specifically by policymakers who know nothing about religion. Literally, they're operating on sort of a folk knowledge of religion. You know, everybody thinks they know something about religion because we tend to be, as Homo sapiens, we tend to be religious. It's easy to be religious, and it's harder to be scientific. If you've taken a calculus course, you know this. Our brains did not evolve to do science. Our brains did evolve to do the sorts of things that religions exploit. So one of my colleagues got very upset at a faculty meeting once when a subatomic particle physicist began making statements about religion. And he got up and said, you know, I have a PhD in religion and you're wrong, but how would you feel if I began making statements about subatomic particle physics, which he admits he knows nothing about. Okay, policymakers are making these decisions all the time, and on very, very bad, often, not always, but often very bad information. So it would be good if policymakers either could find out about religion, or at least had advisors who had a specialty in religion that could say, hey, you're saying stupid things. You know, like when our President Ronald Reagan sent an autographed copy of the Bible to the Ayatollah during the Iranian hostage crisis. That's stupid. And somebody should have told him, that's stupid. And nobody did. Now, will this ever happen? Again, Don Weeb and I recently wrote an article in which we doubt it. We doubt that a scientific study of religion will ever become a paradigm for the study of religion generally in universities. There certainly is a number of research centers and graduate programs where this is going on. But for these reasons that Homo sapiens tend to find religion to be a very easy thing to do, it's so widespread, it's culturally supported, we just don't think, we hypothesize that people will continue to operate on this kind of folk level and not take advantage of the kind of scientific studies that are being carried out. It's a little pessimistic. but we've also written a short article entitled When Pessimism is Realism. One of the things I like to study is the Roman cult of Mithras. And I like to study the Roman cult of Mithras because there's a lot of archaeological remains, but there's no textual evidence. And this makes a challenge. What we know about the Roman cult of Mithras, it was an initiatory cult, and thus I'm interested in rituals of initiation. And we now know that this is one example, techniques employed in initiation rituals are designed, probably over time through trial and error, but designed to produce certain cognitive and somatic shocks to the system. They do so in predictable ways so that you can, for example, we're beginning to track brain processes at the neurochemical level of what goes on when people undergo certain types of initiatory practices. So it's tractable and predictable. And in that way, we can, if it is in fact the case that, okay, the cognitive sciences are based on an evolutionary frame, and the idea is brains haven't changed since the emergence of anatomically modern humans, whenever that was. Brains haven't changed essentially. So then we have in the same way medical people now are diagnosing diseases from antiquity based on what we know about medicine now. I think we can begin to make statements about our insights into behaviors in the past based on what we know now, based on experimentations now. If brains are the same, then that's what these people are doing. They're doing it in a different historical context that's expressed in terms of that context, but we can understand the pan-human cognitive and behavioral processes that are being expressed. If what the cognitive scientists are doing is identifying pan-human behaviors and cognitive defaults, if they're pan-human, historians should have a field day documenting them all the way through history. And if the experimentalists come up with something that the historians don't immediately see going on throughout history, they need to redo their experiments. Their assumptions are incorrect. So I see a necessary relationship between the experimental side of the field and the historical side of the field. I think it would depend on the psychologist. If the psychologists are doing cognitive psychology, I think it's part of the same enterprise. One of the developments that interests me a lot is behavioral economics. This is essentially the application of the insights from cognitive science to economics. It's essentially falsified classic economic theory. And it's shifting the whole field. I don't see the whole field of religion being shifted. There's too much vested interest in, I think, religious appreciation rather than explanation of religion. But what's going on in behavioral economics is in fact changing the entire, is changing marketing, is changing advertising, is changing branding, is changing the whole way the economic system is understood to work. And such a revolution as that I would hope for in terms of the study of religion.